Hello italki teachers! Are you teaching absolute beginners on italki? Well, I got your back. Today I'm going to talk about how I approach lessons with absolute beginners. I'm going to give you some tips on how you could approach these classes, including different activities that you could implement into your next lessons. And best of all, while I try to ensure that all of my videos are useful to all of my subscribers, despite which language they teach, I specifically want to make this one useful to teachers who don't teach English, because I know that a lot of teachers who teach other languages will particularly have a lot of absolute beginners that they're teaching on the platform. So if you're not teaching English, I hope that this is particularly useful for you. So with that being said, stay tuned and let's get cracking. So this video will be in 3 parts. Part 1, I'm just going to talk about some initial approaches to your beginner level students. These are just some general tips in forming conversation with your students. Part 2, I'm going to talk about some specific step-by-step curriculum planning and how to bring them to the intermediate level. And tip number 3, I'm going to give you some supplementary tips that I keep in mind while I'm teaching my students. So first of all, I've spoken in many other videos about how to teach children, particularly beginner level children. So for this video, I'll be focusing specifically on teaching beginner level adults. So tip number 1, the first thing that you should try to implement in your classes, just like with any students, is find out what your students' goals are. Now your students, if they're beginner level, absolute beginner level, they may not know how to communicate what their goals are. And in such a case, it's good for you to actually give them options. So that's tip number 1, give your beginner level students options, right? So when you go into class, instead of asking open-ended questions such as, what are your goals? Even if you're asking them more specific questions like, what kind of food do you like? What kind of weather do you like? Which sports do you like? Give them examples, give them options. Because one way that your beginner level students are going to actually progress very quickly is through you modeling for them. Exposure to your language, they will mimic that, they will recognize some words, and they will learn some new words. And then they will be able to recycle that in their own speech. So number 1, give them options and definitely model the language for them. Let me give you some examples. So where do you come from? Do you live in a town? Do you live in a city? Do you live in the countryside? Why are you learning on italki? For example, is it for a hobby? Is it for travel? Is it for work? How long have you been learning English for? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years? For example, I have been learning French for 5 years. So again, give options, give examples. Open-ended questions with absolutely no input from yourself could very well intimidate your students. With that being said, you don't want to speak too much and come off as overbearing to your students either. So find a healthy mix. All right, so tip number 2, I want you to let your students in. Personalize those lessons for them, okay? And one way to do that, to really build rapport and to build a good relationship with your students, I find, is to actually give them something that they are not just going to see on your profile. Give them something more. And what I've decided to do is to create an actual syllabus. In this syllabus, of course, I have different lessons step by step. However, you don't even have to do that. You could just have a little Google document, 1 page, where you explain some rules that you have in your classes, a little bit about yourself, a personal bio, your picture, and maybe a little bit of extra information such as, contact information, for example. This way, your students will feel like right off the bat, they are engaging, they are interacting with something that is specifically for them, and it's not just for the general public. Of course, there are different reasons for this. This could help you to build rapport with your students. It shows you are professional and you mean business. But I think the most important thing right here, as somebody who is a hobby language learner and knows a lot of other people who are hobby language learners for Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, you name it, is the fact that we do not engage with authentic material until we are at a higher level, like intermediate or advanced. So right off the bat, if you are showing them something that you made personally, not some generic worksheet that they could find online, or something that's available completely to the public, such as your italki profile, then you are immediately giving them some authentic language content in whatever language you speak, and this allows them to interact with this material in a meaningful way. All right, tip number 3, make this student-centered. Okay, a lot of your students may feel a little bit intimidated going into a lesson, especially if the teacher is younger than them. Like, there are different dynamics that could potentially play a part in how you interact with your students. Give them options to make it easier for them, because a lot of your students, for example, if you have a student in German, maybe they learned German when they were in high school and they've forgotten a lot, but all they need is a little bit of exposure to get back into the swing of things. If you teach them from the ground up like they don't know anything, of course, it could be useful for things like grammar, which we'll talk about after, but it could also be discouraging. So for that reason, I suggest that you just try to foster noticing, to foster recognition of certain terms. So one thing you could do is go through a list of 20 common topics. These could be things like housing, transportation, holidays, food, clothing. And you could ask them, what are the 10 topics that you're the most interested in? Which 5 topics would you like to do for our first 5 lessons? Yeah, give them the options, expose them to the language, and they will do the rest of the work for you. So tip number 3, make it student-centered. Tip number 4, I want you to continue exposing your students to the language in different ways, in a multimodal way. So basically, instead of just showing them or just speaking to them and allowing them to hear what you say and to try to pick up words, show them a little bit of text, like I explained in the activity I just spoke about. Another thing you could do is to show them some pictures and ask them to describe the pictures to you. Have a vocabulary list of things that are in the pictures. See if they could match the vocabulary to the different objects in the pictures. Ask them where these things are so that they could use prepositions, and maybe they could even contrast things that are in one picture versus things that are in another picture. And bam, that right there is 10 minutes, and it's not only killing time, it's not only allowing your students to practice, but it's also allowing you to assess your students, which will be very important in the next part that I will speak about. But first, before we go on to part number 2, I just need to say quickly, tip number 5, make sure your students walk away from the first lesson learning something new, okay? Don't be afraid to teach them an idiom or two, even if they're beginner level students. When I talk about an idiom, I'm talking about idiomatic language. So for example, it could be very useful for you to start things off on the right foot and teach them how to say hi and bye in a natural way. In English, I would use, hey, how's it going? See you later. You know, another phrase that a lot of my students get caught up with is, what have you been up to? What did you get up to on the weekend? Now, this might be a little bit too much for beginner level students, and you want to kind of check their understanding first, but this is what we call chunk-based language, learning language in chunks. And there's nothing better, there's nothing more frequent and more useful than making small talk, than greeting people. So make sure that when you're in your first lesson with your beginner adult student, that you teach them a couple natural ways to say hello and goodbye. So now we got some of the groundwork out of the way, and we're going to part 2. This is where I'll talk about step by step how you could proceed, depending on your style, your teaching style, with your beginner level students, okay? So the first thing we need to look at is vocabulary. We need to look at how we're going to get your students to the intermediate level and how we're going to fill in some gaps, because some of your students have had zero exposure to the language. Other ones have had exposure in some areas, but not in others. For example, particularly if you're teaching English on italki, you may, like me, realize that there are a lot of people on italki from Russia or from the Ukraine or from any other Korea, for example, who have very specialized vocabulary. For example, I have students from Russia who don't know a lot of common terms. Let's say abstract nouns, let's say vocabulary related to transportation, to clothing, to food, to weather. But they could tell you every single kind of gun after playing Call of Duty, right? They could tell you every single kind of car from watching Fast and Furious or something like that. So from the media that they consume, they do have a big vocabulary base, but you need to be the one to really analyze and see how many words from the core, from the heart of English do they really have? How applicable is their vocabulary? And there's an easy way to deal with this. Head on to Memrise right now, or you could go to Anki or any other flashcard deck and look up the 2,000 most common words in English. That's a start. No list is absolutely perfect, but there is a give or take idea of the top 2,000 words. Now, we as teachers know that language learning is not completely linear. Sometimes you have to come back to things. It's a cyclical review process for you to actually truly learn different items in the language. However, some of your students may assume that it's linear, it's cut and dry, and it all comes down to math and to a simple formula. X amount of hours allows me to proceed to X level. And if I know this many words, then I could say that I am this level, being B1 or B2 or whatever it may be. But for your beginner level students, let's keep it mathematical. Let's keep it simple. It's 2,000 words. You're going over to intermediate level. Okay? Aside from that, we want to break this down even more and section the words into different topics that you're going to teach your students, right? So this is where the lesson planning really comes in. So that's tip number 6. Teach your students the top 2,000 words. And if you don't have time in class to teach them, allow them to teach themselves. Give them some recommendations to different apps that they could use. For me, I use Anki. Your students may use Quizlet or other vocabulary building apps. And that way they could practice outside of class as well. Tip number 7, grammar focus. A lot of your students will actually pick up grammar naturally as they're proceeding through the language. It's hard to really say which grammar topics you need absolutely at the beginner level to proceed to intermediate level, but there are certain topics that we do know that you need. So for the sake of simplicity, let me talk about certain topics that I would start off with absolute beginner. So if you're teaching Italian or Spanish or Hindi or Portuguese or German or Dutch or any of the other languages that use gender, this is one of the first things that you'll be going for. You're going to be teaching your students about gender and the gender of nouns. So what you may start off with is a little vocabulary list. You could adapt the activity that I spoke about before with different pictures, and then you could start looking at the gender of the different nouns. The first thing that you may choose to do is to teach them the different endings of particular genders, right? So feminine, masculine, and then neutral or the other genders if your language has those genders. Similarly, if you teach something like Italian where your language has gendered nouns which have different endings in the plural and versus the singular, that's another thing you may want to do. So if you have any grammar focus, I would keep it just to nouns to start off and look at the endings depending on the singular, plural, masculine, feminine, etc. Okay, and if you teach English, of course, just go for the singular, plural. And this is also a very good way to introduce numbers, right? So while you're teaching singular, plural, why not teach numbers as well? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that's a good way to integrate this and to also build some vocabulary, because right there, your students learn 10 new. So this is all about finding combinations and pairs and putting things together. Another thing you could do is start teaching your students about family and using possessives, okay? My mother, your father, his sister, her brother, etc. It's also a good opportunity for you to pair this, so you're teaching about possessives, my, your, his, her, etc. Pair this not only with family, but also with what we call demonstrative pronouns, which are that or this. So for example, you could start formulating sentences, that is my sister, this is your brother. And then as you introduce and expose your students to more nouns, then you could use this is my water bottle, that is your door, and you could continue this on. And just like I did right there, make things real, make things useful to your students and relevant. Use things that are actually in the camera if there is anything in the camera, or you could even ask them, like, what do you have on your desk right now? Give me some examples. This is my pencil, this is my book. From here, and this is a big tip to teachers, teach your students how to form questions, because a lot of students never actually learn to form questions because they are in classes where it is either mainly grammar focused and reading and writing focused, so they don't really produce, or they do produce questions but they are in very kind of artificial, so like superficial environments, right? Like in role plays and stuff like that. So you could actually introduce the 5 W's to your students, the who, what, where, why, when, and how, right? Okay, great. So another pair that we could use on this topic with questions is the question words with demonstrative pronouns. So we could have your students answer questions based on a picture. You could share your screen, show your students a picture on your screen, and ask them, what is that? What is this, right? And your students could say, that is a ball, that is a wall, for example, right? So again, we are pairing these different grammatical items together. After that, you could perhaps even do this with who, right? So you could have a picture, maybe even of your family if you're comfortable sharing it. Who is this? She is my mother. So as you cycle through these question words, you could get to a point where you introduce your students to common prepositions. In, on, at, to, right? You could introduce different months and dates and times, right? When do we have class? We have class on Tuesdays. At what time? We have class on Tuesdays at 8 o'clock, right? And then you could begin to expose your students to the past tense as well. And one thing to be aware of is that the past tense in English could be extremely tricky, especially because of the amount of irregular verbs we have in English. Even in the top 100 verbs, I think about 60 of them are irregular, if not more. And this may be true in your language as well, depending on the language that you're teaching. Some languages do not have many irregular verbs. But this is a situation where you could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, ask 1 questions. You could introduce prepositions, and you could slowly introduce them to different modes of time. Another thing you may want to do when you're talking about the time anyway, also work on conjugating different verbs. By this point, hopefully your students have a good idea of simple, common verbs that we use in the language, but you could start getting them to formulate different routines. For example, on Mondays, I walk in the park. On Sundays, I jog down the road. So the next step for grammar would be negation, right? You could go to ask your students different questions, and you could prompt them to say no, right? And how do they say no, right? So you could ask them questions. Do you like this? No, I don't, right? Is that your mom? No, she isn't, right? And this could also be an opportunity for you to introduce contractions where we put 2 words together, such as don't, won't, hasn't. And the last thing before you fall asleep, for the grammar for absolute beginners, adults, I would say to teach them complex and compound sentences. And basically what this is when we have two parts of the sentence, which we call clauses, and they are linked together by different conjunctions, different words we call conjunction. These could be words like even though, although, because, and, right? And there are more rules about this. If you're interested in teaching grammar on italki and you want to know more about this, please check out this course. I have actually created a complete video series with 8 videos, which talks about the different levels of the different elements of speech in English. So you could go ahead and check that out and watch those videos, and I'll go more in depth into these different concepts. Keep in mind that the vast majority of these topics I'm speaking about with regards to grammar exist in every single language. Prepositions, conjunctions, yeah? So they may differ in the way that they are used, but they do exist, right? So this step-by-step method that we're talking about right here will get your students at least halfway through the beginner level and on their way to intermediate. So by the point that you teach your students all of these topics, it could take 10 lessons, it could take 20, or it could take 5. A lot of this depends on your students' aptitude, their motivation, perhaps if they're just naturally gifted with language learning. It could depend on the amount of resources that they have or how spread out your lessons are. It could depend on their fatigue and how busy they are at work as well. But tip number 8, and now we're moving into part 3 where I give you some supplementary tips. This tip is to allow your students to take ownership over their language learning. Another thing that they should have is some information, some intel on the difficulties of the language. This will allow them to kind of make sense of the bumps in the road, so to speak. So for example, when I talk about uncountable nouns with my students or prepositions, I tell them no matter what level they are, yeah, I know they're tricky. I know they're difficult, right? Like if we're talking about irregular verbs, I tell them, yeah, I know they're difficult. If you tell them, if they make a mistake and you correct the mistake and you say it with like a stern look on your face, this could make your students feel like you're talking down to them. Allow them to recognize that that the language could be difficult sometimes. It could be a beast, right? But you could also remind them that you have taught other students, hopefully you have, who have been successful, right? Or that you as a language learner have been successful, right? And point them in the right direction so that they can get their motivation from other sources as well. So for example, maybe share a YouTube video with them of a polyglot, or give them other resources so they could see other people, perhaps people who resemble themselves a little bit more than you do, who have been successful in language learning. And this could really help your students maintain their confidence and their motivation in language learning. Another tip you may want to share with your language learners is to not burn out, because a lot of your students will, you know, they're beginners, and especially if they're learning for a hobby, they will jump in head first and they will be very, very enthusiastic, and then you may not see them again, right? So being realistic with their goals and perhaps like letting them know, especially by this halfway through the beginner course where they're able to understand a little bit of the nuance of the language, start to let them know that burnout is a real thing and give them some tips on how to avoid burnout. So that's tip number 8, helping your students develop good learning strategies. Tip number 9, allow your students to be accountable and responsible. And if they don't take ownership, then try to encourage them to take ownership. Let them know what you are there for. Let them know what you set out to do and what you expect them to do. One thing you could do if you wish is to actually have your students, you could create a contract, a collaborative contract with your students by this point, where they write down what they're going to do every single week. Maybe you write down what you're going to do every single week, such as mark their homework, right? Another thing you could do is just to write down the rules for your class, and they could have to sign it, or maybe even they need to watch a video of you explaining the rules, and you put a bonus code in that video, and then they need to send it to you so you know that they have actually watched it. And this just allows your students to take accountability and ownership over their learning, and to recognize that it is not just you holding their hands, but they are also right there with you in the driver's seat. The last tip that I have for you to keep in mind is to use this as an opportunity to grow as a teacher. Yeah, because I know that a lot of teachers on italki do not get the experience of teaching absolute beginners. And although it may seem daunting, and I know that there are a lot of italki teachers who actually charge beginners more money, I find that it is a very valuable experience, and it could test your patience at times, but it could also test your ability to grow as a teacher and to really witness incredible growth in such a small amount of time. So use this as an opportunity to improve as a teacher. I could tell you, as somebody who doesn't teach many absolute beginners anymore, when I first started on italki I did, and now I don't. In my position, I wish I taught more absolute beginners. Watching the tremendous astronomical growth is just fantastic, and I've seen it with myself as a language student. You're going to see it as a language teacher as well. So use this to your advantage as a way to grow as a teacher. All right, that's it. I hope that has helped you. I hope that gives you some insight. If you have any other tips for absolute beginners, please just throw them down in the box below. I'll probably make a part 2 to this video just to give you some more tips on step-by-step how to conduct your classes for absolute beginners, especially adults on italki. But until next time, thank you for watching. Consider subscribing and keep smiling.